Right now, as you watch this, a war is actively burning in the Middle East, not a proxy conflict. Not an airstrike or two, but a full-scale American military campaign against Iran, now entering its 5th day. 3 American fighter jets have been shot down. 3 U.S. soldiers are dead. Oil prices have surged at their fastest pace in 4 years. Gas is creeping back up toward $3.15 a gallon, and the Federal Reserve is staring down an inflation problem that the White House told us was already solved. Meanwhile, back on American soil, allies of President Trump are quietly floating the idea of invoking emergency powers to take control of federal elections ahead of November's midterms. Senate Democrats say they are ready to force an immediate vote to block it, and a federal judge just ruled that the administration's policy of deporting immigrants to countries they've never set foot in is unlawful. In Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine are still expecting U.S.-led peace talks to happen this week, but the venue is in doubt because the Iran war has closed the airspace over the UAE. Istanbul is now being floated as a backup. Russia has told the world it will walk away from the table unless Ukraine surrenders its industrial heartland, and the clock is ticking. In Brussels, Europe just watched Trump threaten to cut off all trade with Spain because Madrid won't let the Pentagon use its military bases to bomb Iran. The EU is holding its response. For now, and with China, the trade truce that was supposed to bring calm to 2026 is already being tested by a Supreme Court ruling that just blew a hole through the legal foundation of Trump's entire tariff architecture. 5 stories, 1 week, and every single one of them feeds directly into the American economy, into your cost of living, and into the political future of the most powerful country on earth. Stay with me because this is how it all connects. Let's start with the war, because everything else radiates outward from it. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel jointly launched what the Pentagon has called Operation Epic Fury, a massive air and naval campaign targeting Iran's missile infrastructure, its navy, and what officials describe as nuclear development sites. U.S. Central Command confirmed that Iran's air defenses and hundreds of ballistic missile launchers and drone systems have been, in their words, severely degraded. In a recorded video message released shortly after the strikes began, President Trump declared that Iran had waged, quote, a war against civilization. He projected the campaign would last 4 to 5 weeks, though he acknowledged it could go far longer. As of March 4th, at least 555 people have been killed inside Iran, according to a tally from Al Jazeera. 13 have died in Lebanon, 10 in Israel, 3 in the United Arab Emirates, 2 in Iraq. And Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait have each reported 1 fatality amid Iranian retaliatory strikes across the region. On the American side, the Pentagon confirmed the deaths of 3 military personnel, the first U.S. service members killed in the conflict. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth called the mission a clear, devastating, decisive operation, describing it as distinctly different from the long wars of the previous 2 decades. This is not Iraq, Hegseth told reporters. Destroy the missile threat, destroy the Navy, no nukes. Israel, he confirmed, is operating as a partner with its own defined military objectives, though those were not made public. The legal basis for this war remains highly contested. Under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can formally declare war. The president can act unilaterally only in response to an imminent and immediate threat. Yet, in his most recent statement, Trump said the U.S. was very nearly under threat from Iran, a formulation that legal scholars say deliberately walks the line without clearing it. Trump has not appeared before Congress, and no formal authorization for the use of military force has been passed. This point matters not just constitutionally, but politically, because it shapes how allies, adversaries, and financial markets interpret the durability and legitimacy of the campaign. To understand how the United States arrived at open war with Iran, it is necessary to look at the trajectory of the Trump administration's second term in full. Since returning to office in January 2025, President Trump has ordered military action against the Houthi rebel movement in Yemen, authorized strikes on alleged drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean, killing at least 151 people across roughly 45 operations, launched a military operation that resulted in the removal of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power in January 2026, and conducted counterterrorism strikes in Syria and Iraq. Despite campaigning explicitly on ending American military interventionism abroad, the second Trump administration has, by any measure, expanded the use of military force beyond its predecessors. International law experts and United Nations officials have roundly challenged the legal frameworks used to justify many of these actions. Nevertheless, each operation has been framed by the White House as a targeted, high-value mission, distinct from the so-called endless wars of the post-September 11 era. Now, to the economic dimension, because this is where the geopolitics hits every American household. Just weeks ago, Trump was standing at a podium declaring that inflation was tamed and that the Federal Reserve had no excuse for keeping interest rates elevated. That narrative is now under direct pressure. Oil prices surged at their fastest pace in 4 years in the first days of the Iran campaign. On Tuesday, March 3rd, U.S. crude rose more than 5% to $75.22 a barrel. Gas prices jumped 11 cents in a single day, reaching an average of $3.11 nationally, according to AAA. Tom Closa, chief analyst at Gulf Oil, has said that figure is likely to climb further to somewhere between $3.10 and $3.25 per gallon in the short term. Bloomberg Economics published a detailed analysis on March 3rd, warning that sustained high oil prices would place the Federal Reserve in what they described as an impossible position, forced to choose between fighting inflation caused by the war and complying with a president who is actively demanding lower interest rates. The analysis noted that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and natural gas travels through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has threatened to close. A liquid natural gas facility in Qatar was already shut down, contributing to a 10% spike in natural gas prices over recent months. For the U.S. economy, which is already navigating weak hiring trends and an inflation rate stuck at approximately 3%, well above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, the timing could not be more difficult. Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, offered a particularly sobering assessment. He noted that many American companies had already planned to raise prices in 2026 because of tariff-related cost increases, but held off for most of 2025. The Iran conflict, Posen warned, gives those companies additional justification and political cover to raise prices now. This gives them further cover to do it, he told Marketplace, estimating the consumer-level impact would materialize over 2 to 4 months. Alex Yaquez, who served as an economic advisor to the Biden White House, was blunter still. Americans, he said, simply do not believe President Trump is focused on what they are focused on. What they want him to be focused on, Jaquez noted, is the price of groceries. After nearly 5 years of elevated costs, even modest inflationary pressure now carries significant political weight ahead of November's midterm elections. Turning to the domestic political front, the most immediately controversial development breaking in Washington today is the serious discussion inside the Trump orbit about using emergency powers to intervene in how federal elections are conducted ahead of the November midterms. According to NPR, allies of President Trump have floated the concept of invoking those powers to make direct changes to voting rules and potentially deploy federal agents to polling places. Senate Democrats, led by leadership in the chamber, have responded by stating publicly that they are prepared to force an immediate vote to block any such declaration. Democracy Docket, a legal watchdog organization that tracks election-related litigation, has characterized the possibility as a direct and unprecedented threat to the integrity of electoral administration. This story is still developing and no executive order has been signed, but the political shockwaves it is already generating are significant, particularly as Trump continues to invoke the Iran war as a backdrop justifying expanded executive authority. At his State of the Union address on February 24th, the longest in American history by word count, President Trump focused overwhelmingly on domestic economic themes, the strength of the labor market, his administration's handling of the border, and proposals to help private sector workers without employer-sponsored retirement plans save for the future. He touched only briefly on foreign policy, boasting of the military operations already underway and hinting at the possibility of regime change in Tehran. What was striking to many analysts was what he did not say. China and North Korea were not mentioned once. Ukraine received only a passing reference. Economists and foreign policy experts noted that the omission of Asia was particularly telling, given the scale of ongoing trade negotiations and the fact that the U.S.-China tariff truce, brokered in late 2025, is set to expire in November 2026. On the immigration front, a federal judge ruled in late February that the administration's policy of deporting migrants to third countries' nations to which those individuals have no legal, familial, or historical ties is unlawful and must be set aside. The ruling adds to a growing body of court decisions pushing back on the administration's immigration enforcement strategies. FBI Director Kash Patel also made headlines when he ordered the removal of at least 10 FBI employees connected to the earlier investigation into President Trump's handling of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Critics characterized the move as retaliatory. The White House framed it as restoring impartiality to a bureau they say was weaponized against the president. Now to Eastern Europe, where one of the most consequential diplomatic situations of the past 4 years may be approaching a make-or-break moment. Russia and Ukraine were both, as of Monday, March 2nd, still planning to attend a new round of U.S.-led trilateral peace talks expected around March 4th and 5th. However, because the Iran conflict has resulted in the closure of UAE airspace due to missile and drone risks, the planned Abu Dhabi venue is no longer viable. According to a Bloomberg source familiar with the matter, Istanbul is emerging as the most likely alternative. The stakes for this round of negotiations are extraordinarily high. According to people familiar with Kremlin thinking, Russian officials are increasingly of the view that there is no point in continuing U.S.-mediated discussions unless Ukraine agrees to cede the Donetsk region, its industrial heartland, as a precondition for a formal agreement. Russia is prepared to sign a draft peace memorandum, these sources say, if and only if Kyiv agrees to withdraw from eastern Donetsk. Thomas Graham, a former senior director for Russia at the U.S. National Security Council and now a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, summarized the situation starkly. We're at a make-or-break moment. It's a deal or we're at no deal and no serious negotiations for quite some time. 3 rounds of trilateral talks have already taken place in Abu Dhabi and Geneva since January 2026, without producing a breakthrough on the core issues of territory, ceasefire terms, the future of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and security guarantees for Ukraine. A reported 8-point peace framework drafted by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his Russian counterpart, Kirill Dmitriev, prompted serious concern from Kyiv and from European capitals, as multiple sources described its provisions as excessively favorable to Russia. Ukrainian officials and their European allies have consistently warned that any deal which legitimizes Russia's territorial gains risks rewarding aggression and setting a dangerous precedent. Critically, U.S. negotiators have reportedly conveyed to their Ukrainian counterparts that President Trump is likely to become increasingly preoccupied with domestic priorities as the midterm election season accelerates. That political calendar, according to multiple sources familiar with the discussions, creates a closing window for a deal, one that Kyiv believes the U.S. side is trying to rush through before the political incentives for serious engagement fade. American negotiators have reportedly floated the idea of holding a referendum on contested territories and national elections in Ukraine simultaneously as early as May 2026, a timeline that Ukrainian officials and analysts have described diplomatically as unrealistic. One concrete and historically significant development from the recent rounds of talks is the restoration of high-level U.S.-Russia military dialogue, a channel that had been suspended since late 2021, when tensions ahead of Russia's full-scale invasion were already reaching their peak. The re-established communication channel, according to the Associated Press, is intended to provide a consistent military-to-military contact as peace efforts continue. For those tracking the long arc of the conflict, the re-establishment of that line of communication, even in the middle of an active war in Iran, represents a meaningful signal that Washington and Moscow have a mutual interest in keeping direct communication open, even as their postures on Ukraine remain far apart. The economic stakes in these peace talks are also enormous. The World Bank's most recent estimate puts the cost of rebuilding Ukraine's economy at $588 billion. American defense contractors, European reconstruction funds, and energy infrastructure investors are all watching the diplomatic calendar closely. A prolonged stalemate in Ukraine, compounded now by the Iran conflict's upward pressure on energy prices, creates a compound risk scenario for the global economy that analysts are only beginning to fully price in. On the U.S.-China front, the defining event of the past 2 weeks was the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on February 20th that President Trump cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA, to impose tariffs. This 6-3 decision struck down the legal mechanism that had been the backbone of Trump's sweeping tariff architecture, including the now infamous Liberation Day tariffs of April 2025, which at their peak had pushed average U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods to 127.2%, an extraordinary figure by any historical standard. Following the Supreme Court ruling, President Trump moved quickly to replace the invalidated tariffs with new levies imposed under a different legal authority. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allows a maximum tariff of 15% for up to 150 days. After initially announcing a 10% universal tariff, Trump raised the figure to 15%. According to the Tax Foundation's running tracker, the Supreme Court ruling and subsequent executive actions left the U.S. with an overall average effective tariff rate of approximately 13.7% as of late February, down from a peak of roughly 27% during the spring of 2025. For China specifically, the effective rate on many goods remains close to 30% due to the continued presence of Section 301 tariffs targeting unfair trade practices, which were not affected by the Supreme Court's IEEPA ruling. The political and economic consequences of this tariff reshuffling are substantial. The Trade Foundation estimates that the 2026 Trump tariff regime amounts to an average tax increase of approximately $700 per U.S. household. The tariffs have not, by most economic analyses, meaningfully reduced the U.S. trade deficit, one of their stated primary goals. They have, however, contributed to the weakest job growth outside of a recession since 2002, and have created persistent uncertainty for American importers, particularly small businesses that depend on Chinese manufacturing. Despite the friction, the broader U.S.-China relationship entered 2026 inches, a state of what analysts at China Briefing described as a lasting truce, following a summit between Trump and Xi Jinping in October 2025. Under the terms of that agreement, extended through November 2026, China agreed to suspend retaliatory tariffs on major U.S. agricultural exports, including soybeans, pork, and dairy, while the U.S. agreed to reduce fentanyl-related tariffs and extend Section 301 exclusions for certain manufactured goods. China also suspended its export restrictions on rare earth materials, a critical lever that Beijing holds over U.S. technology and defense manufacturing. A survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in China, released in January 2026, found that 79% of member companies held a neutral or positive outlook for the bilateral relationship in 2026, a 30 percentage point improvement from the year before. However, underneath this relative calm, the U.S. government is simultaneously conducting a formal investigation into the economic effects of revoking China's permanent normal trade relations status, a move that would represent one of the most significant escalations in U.S. trade policy in decades. The U.S. International Trade Commission opened that investigation in late February 2026, with a report expected by August. The investigation alone is a signal that the current truce, however stable it appears on the surface, rests on a foundation that remains contested in Washington's legislative and regulatory machinery. Capitol Hill, analysts note, remains deeply skeptical of China, and the truce at the leadership level does not insulate the relationship from that broader institutional pressure. Turning to the Atlantic Alliance, a relationship that has never in the modern era been under greater strain than it is right now. The most immediate flashpoint as of March 4th is Spain. According to multiple reports, including those from RT and confirmed by EU sources, President Trump threatened on or around March 2nd to sever all trade relations with Spain if Madrid refuses to allow U.S. military forces to continue using Spanish military bases to conduct operations against Iran. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez had publicly opposed the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran, placing him in direct conflict with Washington. In response to Trump's trade threat, European Council President Antonio Costa declared that the European Union was ready to protect the interests of its member states, including Spain, against what he characterized as economic coercion. This episode follows a period of severe transatlantic turbulence that erupted in January 2026 over Trump's bid to acquire Greenland, Denmark's autonomous Arctic territory. Trump threatened punitive tariffs on European nations that opposed his annexationist ambitions, triggering an emergency summit in Brussels and near activation of the EU's so-called anti-coercion instrument, a powerful trade countermeasure that European officials informally refer to as the trade bazooka. The crisis was temporarily diffused when Trump backed down from the most extreme elements of his threat following a phone call with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, announcing there was, in his words, the framework of a future deal on Greenland. Critics noted that the details of that framework were never disclosed, and Danish officials pointedly stated that Greenland's sovereignty was not negotiable. The fallout from those events has continued to reverberate through the economic relationship. Following Trump's post-Supreme Court announcement of a new 15% global tariff, the European Parliament's Trade Committee chair, Bernd Lange, called it pure tariff chaos and announced that the committee's vote to ratify the hard-won US-EU trade deal, known as the Turnberry Deal, was being placed on hold indefinitely. The European Central Bank's president, Christine Lagarde, offered a strikingly direct warning on American television. It's critically important that all people in trade have clarity about the future of the relationships, she said. It's a bit like driving. You want to know the rules of the road before you get in the car. European markets fell on the news, reflecting what investors viewed as a return to the fundamental unpredictability that had defined the first year of the Trump administration's second term. José Manuel Barroso, the former president of the European Commission and former Prime Minister of Portugal, did not mince words in a January 2026 assessment that has only grown more relevant since. There are some doubts about the relationship with the United States, Barroso told CNBC. He described the current moment as the lowest point in transatlantic relations since NATO was founded. A poll conducted around the same time found that only 16% of Europeans view the United States as an ally that shares their values, down from 21% in 2024. A striking 20% of European respondents now view the U.S. as an adversary, a figure that would have been almost unthinkable just 3 years ago. The European Union Institute for Security Studies published a sharp analysis at the end of 2025, arguing that Europe must fundamentally rethink its approach to the transatlantic relationship. The report observed that U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Trade Representative Jameson Greer, in a recent visit to Brussels, directly tied any rollback of steel and aluminum tariffs to European agreement to revise its digital regulatory framework, a blurring of trade and technology policy that European officials found deeply alarming. The Institute argued that Europe must now adopt the same transactional approach that Washington uses, linking trade concessions to security outcomes and refusing to allow itself to be sidelined in negotiations about its own continent's future. The Iran war has only intensified that urgency. The EU was not consulted in advance of the strikes, and the implications for European energy security, migration flows, and broader regional stability are direct and profound. Stepping back to look at the interconnected whole, what you are watching unfold this week is not 5 separate stories. It is one story, told across 5 dimensions, all converging on the same set of questions. Can the United States sustain an active military campaign against Iran without triggering the kind of prolonged inflation shock that would damage the domestic economy heading into midterms? Can Trump's administration close a Ukraine peace deal on a timeline driven by political rather than diplomatic logic, and will Russia allow it? Can the de facto truce with China hold through November, while the administration simultaneously pursues emergency tariffs under a new legal framework and investigates whether to revoke China's normal trade status entirely? Can the EU-US trade deal survive the chaos of a new tariff round, a Supreme Court ruling that knocked out its legal foundation, and now a direct confrontation over Spain's military bases? And can the White House deploy emergency powers to influence the mechanics of American elections without triggering a constitutional confrontation that courts and voters will not forgive? The economic picture in particular deserves serious attention. Before the Iran campaign began, the U.S. economy was already showing signs of uneven recovery. Hiring in 2025 was the weakest since 2002, outside of a recession. The Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure remains stuck near 3%. Consumer confidence surveys showed that Americans, despite months of administration messaging about a golden age, continued to hold a deeply gloomy view of their economic prospects, driven largely by the accumulation of price increases over the past 5 years that never fully reversed. Now, layered on top of that existing vulnerability are rising oil and gas prices driven by the Iran conflict, the risk of shipping disruption through the Strait of Hormuz, a new global tariff of 15%, whose legal durability is already being questioned, and the looming expiration of the China trade truce in November. Economists are not yet forecasting a recession, but the word stagflation, the economically painful combination of slowing growth and rising prices, is appearing in serious analytical writing for the first time in years. Ipek Oskardskaya, senior analyst at Swissquote, stated directly that, given that growth in most regions is still recovering from pandemic, trade, and geopolitical tensions, stagflation risks may re-emerge, depending on how long Middle East tensions last. Emmanuel Cao, head of European equity strategy at Barclays, offered a counterpoint, noting that if the Iran conflict ultimately leads to greater regional stability, oil prices could actually fall back and growth could benefit in the medium term. Both of those scenarios are live possibilities. The honest answer, as of today, is that no one knows how long this war will last. In the coming hours and days, here is what to monitor. On the Iran front, the single most critical variable is whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open. A formal Iranian closure of that waterway, through which roughly 20% of global oil and gas flows, would represent a step change in the economic severity of this conflict. President Trump has said the campaign is projected to run 4 to 5 weeks, but he has acknowledged it could run longer. Watch for any Iranian announcement regarding the strait, any attack on Gulf state energy infrastructure, and any sign of escalation toward a ground operation, which the Pentagon has not publicly endorsed, but also has not ruled out. On the domestic front, the emergency powers question around elections will likely come to a head in the coming days or weeks. If Trump signs any executive order touching electoral administration, it will immediately face legal challenge and likely reach the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. Senate Democrats have telegraphed their procedural response. Watch the White House's communications carefully, and watch whether any executive order references the Iran war as the justification for domestic emergency measures. That linkage, legal scholars say, would be constitutionally unprecedented. On Ukraine, the next 48 to 72 hours are potentially decisive. The trilateral talks, expected around March 4th and 5th, are being described by informed observers as the most consequential since negotiations began in January. If Russia walks away, or if the venue change to Istanbul disrupts the logistics sufficiently, the peace process could stall for months, with profound implications for European security, for energy markets, and for the political legacy of a president who promised to end the war in 24 hours. On China, the key date to watch is the 10th of November 2026, when the current trade truce expires and multiple suspended tariffs and export control rules are scheduled to snap back into effect simultaneously. Between now and then, the U.S. ITC investigation into revoking China's permanent normal trade relations status will be producing findings. Any signal from Beijing that it views the new 15% Section 122 tariff as a violation of the spirit of the October 2025 agreement could trigger a rapid re-escalation. China's suspension of rare earth export controls is the single most important concession on the table, and it is the one Beijing can reverse most quickly. On Europe, the European Parliament's delayed vote on the Turnberry Deal is a bellwether to watch. If it remains suspended indefinitely, it signals that the transatlantic economic relationship is entering a period of managed uncertainty that could persist through the U.S. midterm elections. Spain's response to Trump's trade threat and the EU's collective response to it will tell us a great deal about whether Europe is finally prepared to leverage its economic weight in a way that it has, until now, largely declined to do. So here is where things stand on the morning of March 4th, 2026. The United States is fighting a war it did not ask Congress to authorize. Its economy is absorbing oil price shocks on top of tariff-induced uncertainty. Its domestic politics are edging toward a confrontation over the very mechanics of how elections are held. Its peace diplomacy on Ukraine is approaching a fork in the road from which there may be no easy return. Its trade truce with China is durable on the surface but fragile underneath. And its relationship with Europe, its oldest, deepest alliance system, is operating at what a former European Commission president described as its lowest point since NATO was born. This is not normal geopolitical noise. These are structural shifts happening simultaneously, at speed, in a political environment where the November midterms are already casting a shadow over every decision made in the White House. The political incentives running through each of these 5 stories, the need to project strength abroad while managing costs at home, the need to move fast on Ukraine before the diplomatic window closes, the need to keep China quiet while signaling toughness on trade, these incentives are not always compatible with each other. And the risk is that in trying to manage all of them at once, the administration creates pressure points in its own strategy that adversaries will look to exploit. What is certain is that the weeks ahead will be defining. The arc of each of these stories, Iran, Russia, Ukraine, China trade, the European alliance, and the battle over democratic norms at home, will depend heavily on decisions made in Washington in the very near term. Watch this space. And if this kind of deep, connected analysis of the forces shaping American policy is useful to you, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere near over.